Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to the Lorkhon Saga Nutshell series. Ascendance is coming. This new story is the culmination of 5 years of ideas and storytelling. And in anticipation of the series, I've decided to create a collection of Lorkhon Saga Nutshell videos that will answer all of your burning questions about the story, how the concept was born. All right, so in the last episode, we talked about Robard Graves and his origin. And although the origin of Robard Graves is not where the Lorkhon Saga lore begins, Robard eventually becomes a significant character. So having that background information is really helpful just in understanding his role in the story as he gets involved later on. So if you're interested in watching those videos, remember, in the description below, there is a complete Lorkhon Saga viewer's guide. It will show you those particular videos and playlists that are relevant to watch, that are part of the lore canon, and also the correct viewing order. You're going to want to check that out. Now, today, we are going to cover Ashes. And this series is really where the lore begins. And we pull some other characters and stories from previous playlists into this later. But this is the one where we really start to see the Lorkhon concept evolve. Now, as per usual, spoiler warnings. There are going to be a whole bunch of spoilers in here. This is a recap. So we are going to be talking about the characters in depth. We're going to be revealing things that actually happen during the series. So if you don't want those spoilers, if you want to go back and watch those, check out the viewer's guide so that you know what order to watch them in, and you'll find the playlists in the description below. All right, so the series that we're talking about right now is called Ashes. This story features two primary characters. The first is MARLEVOUR Keenlit, and the second is a character of Breton descent we know as Nestrin. Now, Nestrin will eventually become Shadeling, or is known as Shadeling throughout the series, but if you watch this, you'll definitely get some background information so that you can understand who Shadeling was before he became Shadeling. So, it is about these two characters. Another thing I think that is important to point out is that chronologically, the Ashes story was released after Runerunner. But if you look at the viewer's guide in the link below, you will see that in terms of story chronology, Ashes comes before Runerunner. There are some reasons that I did it that way. Some of these events are kind of taking place at the same time. And one of the things that we learn in the Runerunner series is, well, actually, we don't even learn that in the Runerunner series. We learn it when Vander pops up in some of the storyline for Barbarian. We learn that Vander was actually, in a way, lured to Skyrim for the purposes of getting some things done for Marl. And we'll talk about Marl's transformation from an apparently harmless old man into a very scheming and conniving individual in later episodes. But I want to make sure that you kind of understand what's going on there. So that is why the viewer's guide is really, really important. It's really a different experience watching Runerunner when you have the previous context of Ashes under your belt already. Then some things really start to make sense, and it becomes quite interesting. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about Marl. Who is he? He is of Dunmer descent, so he's Dunmer. He is older when this story starts. He is reported to be somewhere around 500 years old. He is idiosyncratic. He is arrogant. He is a person who is completely devoted to his research and extremely single-minded in his focus on that. We will find later on that he does have a soft side, But at the beginning of the series, he's very much about his job, about his research, and that seems to be it. He comes from Morrowind. He has been part of House Telvanni for many years. Unfortunately, his standing with House Telvanni has suffered considerably. They consider him and his research to be an embarrassment, and we get the impression in the first few episodes that Marl is really sort of viewed inside of House Telvanni as a joke. So let's talk about Nestrin. Nestrin is obviously not Dunmer. He's Breton, and so he's much, much younger than Marl is. But what we discover about Nestrin, what we know about him, is that he's extremely intelligent and adept with magic, and that he actually worked for House Telvanni as a research assistant. He actually believes in Marl's work, and he's one of the few people that does, and he actually seeks out a position to work with Marl. And we will see in that series that there are these moments where, it's revealed how surprising it is to Marl that there is a researcher who's willing to work with him, because most people in House Telvanni view Marl as kind of a quack. So that's what little we know about Nestrin. He's younger. He's a magic adept. He's a natural. He's very, very intelligent, and that he is chosen to work as Marl's research assistant because he believes in the research. So now we kind of have this thing. I'm sort of going meta here. I'm not necessarily following the chronological order of the episodes as they come out. I'm throwing out some larger concepts that will help give context to some of the things that we will talk about later. So they're in Morrowind. They're part of House Telvanni. Marl is really involved in his research. He's absolutely convinced that there are elements of power, these Lorkhon particles contained in the ash, and the ash poses a danger to everybody on the continent that is not being acknowledged by House Telvanni. They're focusing all of their interest on Neloth's research, on the Heartstones specifically, and ignoring the impact and the potential danger of the ash. And the principal concept in his research, or the principal threat that he outlines, is the fact that Heartstones are huge chunks of rock that can be ejected from the volcano, but because of their size and weight, they are going to land in relatively close proximity to the mountain, whereas the ash gets into the upper atmosphere and goes everywhere, spreading its effects all over, right? And so he believes this is a much more pervasive threat, and that to ignore it is foolish. So they're going about this process, doing this research, and we have revealed in the dialogue of the story something that I just refer to as the incident. Over the course of time, what we come to realize is that Nestrin is a person who is calm, he is grounded, he is very self-aware and self-accepting. He is also very idealistic. And one of the things that we discover is that Nestrin has been venturing outside the walls of House Telvanni. And this is really significant. The reason that it's significant is as the story is playing out, and again, remember, this is a flashback. We're looking into the past about 100 years or more before the events that take place in the Ashes story. There is some kind of terrible plague going on in Morrowind, which is not clearly explained or defined in the story. And the members of House Telvanni have been sequestered inside their fortresses, their citadels, doing their research, and going outside the walls is forbidden. Well, Nestrin can't do this. He sees people outside the walls who are suffering. He sneaks out during the night, and he's administering healing. He's using his magic to help people. Well, this eventually gets Marl in some trouble because they are not supposed to be going out, and he is viewed as not really having complete control of his research assistant. So He reprimands him, but what we hear in this dialogue is an eventual softening of Marl's attitude about this. And eventually, Marl himself goes outside the walls secretly to try to help Nestrin in his efforts to assist people who are struggling with this plague. Now, we don't know what this plague is, all right? But what we see is that Nestrin is flouting the rules because of his idealism, and eventually Marl becomes... eventually Marl is on board with this as well. Now, sometime during this period, something happens outside the walls which is unexpected. Nestrin is somehow attacked and infected with the sanguine virus, and he is suffering considerably, and they're doing this in secret. Because they weren't supposed to go outside the walls, they can't go to anyone for help without that transgression being discovered. So Marl is secretly trying to find the antidote or the cure to this vampiric sickness before it completely takes his friend Nestrin. He tries many different things, and he is able to slow the progress of the disease, but he is not able to stop it. And the turning point in this struggle, we discover, is a moment in which Nestrin tries to commit suicide. He attempts suicide because the thought of becoming a vampire is impossible for him to accept. He's unsuccessful in his attempt, but this event spurs Marl into taking much more drastic action. And with him at the end of his rope, having tried cures and having the Telvanni Council breathing down his neck and fear of discovery, he takes drastic action. What he ends up doing is he ends up mixing a concoction and administering that concoction to Nestrin, which basically puts him into sort of a potion-induced coma. And not knowing what to do, he looks at what he's discovered as the potential harmful and healing powers of the Lorkhon particles contained in the ash, and he rolls the dice. So with his friend in a coma, he packs him in a crate, uncovers him in ash, and seals the crate shut. And here we are. So that's what we understand. This is the act of a very desperate man, right? And we can envision a situation where Marl, on a daily basis is opening that crate and brushing the ash off of his friend's face and looking to see if he's awake, looking to see if he's still breathing, looking to see if he's getting better. And there doesn't appear to be a change. So he keeps him in that ash with the understanding that at the very least, the ash seems to be stabilizing his condition. All right. So there we are. Now, we've got Nestrin in the box. We've got Marl continuing on with his painful and conflicted existence, monitoring his friend on a daily basis. And he does this for roughly 100 years. Yes, you heard that right. 100 years. Nestrin is in this box in sort of a comatose state for 100 years. During that time, Marl is continuing to do his research and getting continually more frustrated as House Telvanni blocks him from making any progress. It becomes clear that the Telvanni Council has bought into Neloth's theory of the Heartstones completely, but are unwilling to acknowledge Marl's. And what eventually happens is that Marl lashes out publicly at Neloth and his research, calling Neloth a no-talent hack whose specific methods are suspect and whose data is fundamentally flawed, calling Neloth self-serving and arrogant, right? This is really the last straw for House Telvanni, and they officially excommunicate him. So here we have a man 500 years old, considered old by Dunmer standards, who's given his life to this research and now finds himself out on the street with no prospects, no money, and really just several crates filled with his possessions. Now, what is he to do? Well, he obtains a job in Skyrim. And it is a lowly job. It is a job he considers to be well beneath his capability. And it is a job tutoring the children of the Jarl of Whiterun, Balgruuf's children. And so he sets out for Skyrim and says, you know what? Skyrim is the place that I've determined the Lorkhon particles are having the greatest impact. Maybe while I'm there, I can use this tutoring job to keep myself fed, clothed, and sheltered, and I can spend some time working on my research in the field as opposed to sitting in a laboratory all the time. Maybe I can learn more by being in the field. And so that's what he does. And with the very first episode of Ashes, we find Marl arriving in Skyrim in solitude with all of his possessions. He has acquired a cart, and traveling with him are his two helpers. Traveling with him is his manservant, Mr. Whack, and his bodyguard, Teldrin Sero. And in that very first episode, we see them acquiring a cart and loading it up with stuff and preparing to travel to Whiterun to start his new career as a tutor. So it's important to know that with the beginning of Ashes, this is where I really started experimenting in a much more real way with having multiple characters and storylines. Now, up to this point, I'd made some NPCs. I hadn't done anything really structured, though. Ashes was where the first time I did something structured. So I had 2 player characters in Marl and Shadeling, and then I also had 2 NPCs, Marl and Shadeling. And really the goal was to interweave those stories. So as you can imagine, I've got 2 separate profiles in Mod Organizer, one for each of the characters, and then I've got a common mod list between them. I have to have a common mod list so that their worlds look the same. And then I am basically playing these characters in turn, doing different quests. And the way that the series is structured is that we get a couple episodes of Marl's story, followed by a couple episodes of Shadeling's story, and they alternate. And we understand that these events are taking place at the same time in different parts of Skyrim. In the description below, you will find a link to a playlist that ties all of these together. These 2 playlists, these 2 individual playlists are tied together into a single one, and all the videos are in the right order. So that if you watch that playlist in order, you're getting all of the episodes as they were intended to be viewed. When they originally came out, Marl's story was public, and Shadeling's story was Patreon and was released a little bit later. This ended up being a little bit problematic because the Shadeling stories came out late enough that sometimes it was hard for people to keep track of the story. So eventually I just opened up both to everyone and made a single playlist showing them all in order. All right. So we've got Marl taking the tutor job. He's got his 2 companions who are traveling with him. And kind of what we see in terms of a general progression for Marl is that he will be tutoring during the week, but on the weekends, they load up their cart, which they call the adventure wagon, and they go out on weekend field trips doing research to different locations that are around Whiterun. And so that is kind of what we see, this cadence that Marl and his 2 companions begin to follow. Now, while this is going on, we see Shadeling emerge. One of the problems that we have in the first couple episodes is we realize that when Marl traveled to Skyrim, he brought with him the crate that contained Shadeling's comatose body. Now, somewhere along the line, after landing in Skyrim, that crate was stolen by bandits. And this is distressing to Marl. And one of his goals is to try to figure out what happened and to recover Shadeling, but he's also in a situation where he's running dangerously low on money, and he needs to get himself set up with a base of operations and some income so that he can start conducting a search and figuring out what happened to this crate. So in the meantime, the crate is stolen by bandits, and these bandits sell the crate and its contents to a group of necromancers at Fort Snowhawk. Now, these necromancers are particularly interested in this. They open the box and they see this body covered in ash that appears to be comatose, but is emitting a powerful aura of magic. And their curiosity is piqued. So their idea is that they're going to start conducting research on this body to try to figure out who it is, what the source of the power is. Well, sometime during this, Shadeling wakes up and all hell breaks loose. All right? So what is Shadeling? All right? He was basically struck down with sanguine, right? Which normally will transform you into a vampire. What we know is that Marl took some steps to try to slow the progress of the disease, and he seems to have been successful in doing that. But then in his desperation, he takes this body, which is slowly transforming into a vampire, and packs it into a crate filled with ash, surrounding the body with Lorkhon particles, which leach their power into Shadeling's body over the course of 100 years. What does that transform Nestrin into? Well, at first, we think it might be something like a soul vampire. He doesn't seem to feed on blood, but he seems to require souls, perhaps. However, our understanding of that need shifts over time, and what we begin to realize is that really he's not feeding on souls per se. He's feeding on magical essence, and there is magical essence contained in everyone and everything. So what we see Shadeling begin to do is he wakes up with this terrible craving for power. At first, it looks like he's some kind of a soul vampire as he kills the necromancers and steals their souls, and eventually uses this to power himself, and he becomes more lucid and more active. But what we also realize is that this is not the same person that went into the crate. He uses kind of a plural speech, speaking of himself as we and our instead of individually. He doesn't somehow view himself as an individual anymore. He seems to possess a really sort of alien and strange intelligence. He doesn't view the world the way that everyone else does. He seems to see something else that others don't see. We also begin to understand that he has a very strange and powerful well of magic that seems to be innate. And he draws from that to do fairly incredible things, and he does things in an odd way. So when we say alien intelligence, the way that he fights, the way that he conducts himself is very different than you would expect from a typical mage. He seems to do things with a flourish, and he seems to do things in an order that appears on the surface to be random or inefficient. But when he destroys, when he kills, when he observes, when he absorbs, he does it in ways that are pretty fantastical and over the top. His ways of thinking are eventually revealed to be linked to Aetherius, or what he begins to refer to as the pattern. And we start to see him focused on this idea of fixing the pattern, as if he were a spider fixing a broken and knotted spider web. His personality is very childlike, and he only has fleeting and broken memories of his previous life. He emerges from the box very disoriented. All right, so we've got Marl in Whiterun. We've got Shadeling and Snowhawk. We've got quite a few scenes where, Marl is working with the kids, right? He's tutoring in Whiterun, but all the while he is worried about Shadeling. Shadeling is absorbing these souls in magic and so forth, trying to satiate 100 years of hunger. But as I said before, At first, it appears that he's some kind of a soul vampire, but what we realize is that it's not really about souls. He seems to be draining life force from beings, but that also translates into the draining of power from word walls. He absorbs magic from enchanted items. He's basically absorbing this power from everything around him and using it to power himself. He is also able to connect with this thing he calls the pattern. And he talks about following the threads of the pattern. And in this way, he's seeing some kind of extra dimensional overlay on the world. This overlay allows him to see where problems reside. And what we come to understand about Shadeling is he does not view the world as black and white, good and evil. It's basically is and is not. You know, his view on the world is that in order for the universe to function, the pattern needs to be in good order. And he's finding things in Skyrim that are disruptions in the pattern that he's compelled to fix. Now, as he is tracing his way through this sort of cosmic roadmap, he's able to determine Marl's location and begins to seek out Marl. So at this point, Marl has no idea that Shadeling exists. He believes that Nestrin is still in a crate somewhere, and he's got to find that crate. Little does he know that Shadeling is actually out and actively seeking him out. So Shadeling is able to sense Marl and tracks him to Whiterun. He secretly uses his magic to infiltrate Whiterun and takes up residence in a dark attic space inside Dragon's Reach. And there he is, and we see a scene where he actually observes Marl coming in to talk to the Jarl, and Marl has no idea that he's there watching from the rafters. In fact, nobody does. Then finally, they have a strange kind of late night, early morning meeting where Shadeling reveals himself to Marl, and they have kind of a hushed and frantic conversation behind the bannered mare. At that point, Marl does something interesting. He gives Shadeling some guidance, and we get the impression that he's worried for Nestrin's safety. He gives Nestrin some guidance that he should go to the shrine of Azura and investigate the power that he finds there. What that tells us is that Marl seems to know something about Azura's star, and his hypothesis is that the star will help to feed Shadeling's ongoing need for power. Now, this is interesting, especially when we think about what Marl did or was doing during those 100 years where Nestrin was in a coma. We start to get the sense that Marl was spending an awful lot of that time trying to investigate what was going on with Nestrin's body, what his body needed, and whether or not he might come out of the coma. We start to get the impression that Marl has done his homework and is actually much more streetwise than he appears on the surface. At that point, we see Shadeling leave Whiterun and head off to the Shrine of Azura, where he does the Azura's Star side quest. And we can kind of see all of that come together. The Azura's Star relic is then basically absorbed into Shadeling, is incorporated into his body, and becomes something like a power plant for him. And at that point, we see kind of a situation where Shadeling seems to be able to harness more power and seems to be able to capture souls at will with very little effort. He seems to be able to absorb power from things, and there seems to be also less desperation about finding power. As Shadeling grows in power, we start to see him change the world around himself. And this happens over several episodes. It starts out with simple changes in his gear. Now we see episodes where it seems like, you know, every few episodes of the story, Shadeling's mask is changing and evolving almost with his personality and his goals. His gear changes considerably. It becomes darker and darker until he's almost like an ink blot. And he conceals his face behind a mask principally because he feels he is stripped of identity. Identity doesn't seem to be important to him, and the mask is sort of symbolic of that, and it's constantly evolving and changing. Eventually, we see him gain enough power that he can actually change the physical environment around himself. And the characters will eventually meet again in a location called Shriekwin Bastion. And this comes in Ash's... the episode is called A Shriek in the Night Part 2. So Shadeling really rejects his old life and refuses to be called Nestrin. Nestrin is an individual who's dead and gone. We are now Shadeling, is how he refers to himself, and he insists that Marl do so as well. He also asks Marl quite a few questions in this one regarding whether or not he is an unperson. Shadeling seems to be very concerned about whether or not he's undead. Marl and Shadeling talk, and Shriekwind seems to become the lair of Shadeling and his safe place. It also transforms into his nexus of power. And so when we see Shadeling, people coming to have an audience with Shadeling, they are traveling to Shriekwin Bastion. And this space was, it has been transformed significantly over the years through mods to kind of become this space. In the upcoming series, in Ascendance, we are going to see brand new displays of power from Shadeling, especially in the way that he has transformed his space, and it is going to become more of a bridge into other dimensions. At first, it was a dark, safe place where he could hide. But as his power has grown, he has, just by his very nature, ripped holes in the fabric of reality, piercing other worlds, and we see that evident in his new lair. And we'll see that in Ascendance in a big way. We've done this already in Ashes, but we'll see it in an even more significant way going forward. One of the things that also happens that is of interest, that gives these characters, I think, a lot of dimension and helps us build empathy with them and their situation, is that through the course of this conversation in Shriekwin Bastion, this is where we get the reveal of what Marl's thinking was in trying to save his friend Nestrin. But we also get the distinct impression that they were more than just friends to one another. They had much deeper feelings for one another, and they had a bond that was romantic in nature. And this plays out a little bit more in later episodes, not only of Ashes, but in the side series that came out later, Son of Stars and so forth. We definitely see the pain that emotional break has had on them. And we are able to sort of humanize Marl through that pain. We understand that, putting this person that he loved in that box was the hardest thing he ever did. Losing him was difficult. And then to get him back only to find that he has rejected his previous life and is not the man he used to be, is extremely painful for Marl and difficult. And that comes through in the story in a number of different ways. Now, of much importance, Ashes, Heart of Stars Part 2. It is revealed that the Ideal Masters are in some way responsible for transforming Shadeling into what he is. And we discover that this is a plot by the Ideal Masters to bring down Lord Lorkhon, who they view as stealing souls that should belong to them. Essentially what they've done is they've found a way to weaponize Nestrin into this thing called Shadeling, but they lost control of their weapon when Marl transported him to Skyrim. So, to try to recapture their weapon, they take a powerful crystal from the Soul Cairn and they place it in Skyrim. thinking that it will attract Shadeling like a moth to a flame, and they would capture him. The gem does indeed attract Shadeling, as they expected. But what they didn't realize is that Shadeling is far more powerful than they ever could have imagined. He takes the power of the trap, this crystal that is supposed to pull him into the soul cairn where they can capture him. He takes the power from that crystal, he absorbs it, amplifies the power, mixes it with his own, and he pushes that power back through the crystal, through the trap that they've created for him, in a huge blast that devastates the Ideal Masters. If you want to see the cinematic for that, you can see that at the very beginning of Ash's Heart of Stars Part 3. But this event is extremely important to understanding who Shadeling is, and is also very, very important to the storyline of the new series, Ascendance. So you want to pay attention to that. That is going to be, I think, an important linchpin. So if nothing else, take away from this that the Ideal Masters are important to pay attention to. So at this point, Shadeling has broken away from the Ideal Masters. He's thwarted their pursuit. And he's on a mission to basically become the caretaker of the pattern, or the caretaker of Aetherius. His power and his apparent omnipotence expands with each episode. He appears to be prophetic, but what he's actually doing is he's following the threads of this thing he calls the pattern, and he's looking for places where it's broken. And by following the pattern forward in time, he can predict events, and he can manipulate what's happening in the present so that he can create situations in which the pattern will repair itself. As his power grows, we see him doing incredible things, using spells in unique ways, stealing power from dragons, actually running across the Ghost Sea to go to Solstheim. Meanwhile, while Shadeling is doing all these things, Marl forms a group that he calls the League of Prodigious Illumination. And this is a group he puts together almost like a business, and then he goes out and markets this in such a way that he can get funding from people who might be interested in supporting his effort, go to the Mage College and build some credibility, bring on board other people who might be interested in helping him, and also use it as sort of a clearinghouse of information where people who have had experiences that they might attribute to the Lorkhon particles can reach out to this League of Prodigious Illumination and tell their stories. This group that he is forming is based near Windhelm at an inn called the Carpathian Inn. We see Marl investing significant money to help rebuild the hotel in exchange for keeping the upper floor for himself and for his group to meet. And so that's kind of going on there. Unfortunately, his efforts are made difficult by his wild theories, his eccentricities, and even his companions, who get him kicked out of the Mage College for defiling the Magicka fonts and for stealing chickens from the locals, stuff like that. So it's kind of a comedy of error as he tries to build his credibility, and all the while is actually hurting his credibility. Shadeling now has traveled to Solstheim and moved into Apocrypha, seeking to protect Marl from Hermaeus Mora. He begins the work, but then he stops short when the pattern reveals that there is another path to defeating Hermaeus Mora through a still unknown barbarian from Atmora who has yet to emerge. And so we see Shadeling pull back from that as he opens up an opportunity for someone else to take on that role that he believes will be more effective. This is really where Ashes ends and the individual stories begin. In these other individual stories, the League of Prodigious Illumination and Son of Stars, there are a few things that come to light. We learn more about Shadeling's history and his relationship with Marl. We get more flashbacks in terms of memories that Shadeling has while he is out adventuring about things that happened in his previous life. We also start to see Marl's growing machinations. We start to see Marl as a schemer, and we understand actually how smart Marl is. There's that phrase, crazy like a fox, right? The individual who appears to be harmless on the surface, but is thinking 5-10 moves ahead of everyone else behind the scenes. And we start to understand that this is who Marl is. We also start to see some interesting effects of the Lorkhon particles in those who are involved in them, in that Marl becomes more athletic. His apparent age seems to be reversing itself. He seems to be getting younger and sprier and sharper and more effective. And we kind of see this across the board with all of those people who are involved as part of what will become the Dragonborn Covenant. So this is also where the Covenant comes to life in these other videos, and then continuing on into Barbarian is where we start to see the characters pull together. So if you want to see those things, definitely get out there and watch them. You will find them also in the viewer's guide, which will show you the right order. Also, if you're just really interested in Shadeling's combat style, there are a lot of videos out there in a playlist called Shadeling for Hire. It is not story canon per se, but it is a really fun watch. They are viewer assassination challenges, and I tried to come up with the most creative ways I could think of to assassinate these characters and complete these contracts. So if you want to check that out, that's just a super fun watch. All right, stay tuned for the next Nutshell episode, where we are going to discuss the origin and role of Vander Nightbrook and the Rune Runner series in this whole thing. For more information, check the description for links to the videos, podcasts, and resources mentioned. You'll also find the definitive Lorkhon timeline explaining all of the playlists and characters that are part of the Lorkhon saga canon in the recommended viewing order in the description below, as well as links to the episodes that I mentioned and the playlists that they are contained in. Thank you, and I will see you in the next Nutshell.
Steep incline. Mind the brakes. Ooh, goodness. Okay. Very good. Now, I think this would be an appropriate place to start looking for possible campsites.